Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. Their ongoing study in the book On Being a Christian by Hans Küng, published way back in 1976. We begin part 3 of the book. We're going to be taking a look at the challenge of world religions. It does kick off part 3. We'll look at pages 89 to 99 to get started. And we're going to look at revaluing the world religions, stretching the concept of ecclesia, and the problem of world religions. Let's begin with block 1. Okay, block 1. More than mere religion. Christianity is more than mere religion. It is the social realization of a relationship to the absolute ground of meaning, where the self is unconditionally involved. We take a revalued stance toward other religions. Christian mission in the East is difficult, almost impossible. Hellenized Christianity cannot simply be transplanted in the East, says Professor Küng. We need to replace contempt with esteem, neglect with understanding, propaganda with dialogue, and enlist native clergy and discover true inspiration. Therefore, his conclusion, note 3, block 1, note 3, transcending religion and dialogical approach equals reaching true inspirational wealth toward other religions. Okay, so what do we mean by inspirational wealth? Every religion is a mixture of faith, superstition, and unbelief. They all address world order, human identity, and ethical awareness. They all seek a way of salvation out of the misery of experience. All world religions are aware of man's alienation. All perceive the graciousness of divinity. Now, even though we take this new positive dialogical approach, Professor Küng is quick to point out that we failed, actually, in our initial response by stretching the concept of church, and that was the wrong approach. So our first concrete approach in block 2 was incorrect, says Professor Küng. So in block 2, characteristics of other religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. Life is suffering, and new life engenders new suffering, but liberation is possible. Confucianism and Taoism. Confucianism centers on harmony of the universe and interpersonal relationships and adapting the self to the world order. Taoism advocates return to unspoiled nature, mysticism, and rejuvenation. Islam. Muhammad is God's prophet, and there are 5 basic duties: faith, prayer, fasting, helping the poor, and pilgrimage to Mecca. In view of this, consequences regarding Christianity. Origen posited the notion, no salvation outside the church, which the Catholic Church took that up to mean no salvation outside the Catholic Church. Küng opposes that axiom. Vatican II conceded freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and stated that those who attain explicit knowledge of God can attain and may attain salvation. And Professor Küng was a major force in Vatican II. And that all men of goodwill belong to the church. So, his conclusion, note 3, characteristics of other religions and explicit knowledge of God equals opening up the universality of the church. Can there be such a thing as anonymous Christians? The will of those outside the church are not to be interpreted in light of our own interests. Instead, they should be respected. Otherwise, we shut up the possibility of dialogue. Stretching the concept of church is no answer, says Professor Kuhn. What you have to remember here is that Kuhn opposes the rigid dogma of the Catholic Church, no salvation outside the Catholic Church. Now, the universal Church of Jesus Christ, there can be salvation outside the Catholic Church within other denominations. This is affirmed. But we don't stretch the concept of church. We don't say, well, everyone is included in the church. We don't stretch the concept of church. It still must be the Church of Jesus Christ. But we do negate that old axiom, no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So remember that distinction, because Kuhn affirms the fact that yes, there is salvation in other denominations that participate in the Church of Jesus Christ. But he opposes the old Catholic axiom, no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So it's a big difference, but you don't stretch the concept of church. You don't distort the concept of ecclesia. You don't do that. So now let's move on to block 3 and take a look at world religion as an internal problem. World religions have become an internal and qualitative challenge to the Christian church. The fate of Christianity itself is thrown into question, and Christianity cannot simply belittle other religions and thereby exalt itself. That narcissistic position can't be taken. However, we do recognize that the world religions have their own problems of contradictory structures, weaknesses, and errors. In conclusion, differences cannot simply be smoothed out through the enlistment of phenomenology, which was a trend at the time when Professor Kuhn was writing this manuscript. Just simply smoothing things out with phenomenology is an incorrect approach. So Block 1 gave us a revaluing of world religions, and that we do have a Christianity that does transcend the concept of religion, but we do take a dialogical approach to other religions. We don't shut off dialogue. Then we can find true inspirational wealth, because we mutually address world order, human identity, and ethical awareness. Those are common crossroads for dialogue. And we all seek a way of salvation out of alienation. That's what he gave us in Block 1. Now, Block 2, he points out a couple of things. Basically, from a concrete point of view, the idea of just expanding the concept of ecclesia and making it inclusive of all the other religions by interpreting them and smoothing them out through phenomenology is a wrong approach. It's no answer. You don't stretch the concept of ecclesia. However, he does tell us that he negates the Catholic axiom, the old Catholic axiom prior to Vatican II of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. He negates that old antiquated axiom. So there is salvation in the Church of Jesus Christ, and that can be in other denominations other than the Catholic denomination. But we don't stretch the concept of ecclesia and say that everyone is included regardless of what religion it is. We don't do that. That's the concrete aspects being addressed in Block 2. So his conclusion in Block 3 is basically a conclusion that phenomenology can't be the, postmodern phenomenology is kind of a leftist phenomenology, really. And he says that approach is wrong. You can't just obliterate all differences and say, well, we're all the same. That's not true. So you can't just enlist phenomenology and say differences don't matter. Differences do matter quite a bit. And we're going to see that in the upcoming lessons, but differences are significant when comparing Christianity to other religions, and so we don't smooth out differences. So we get a great look at the revaluing world religions and then not. So basically we had our affirmation in block 1, the affirmation of revaluing world religions. Then we had the negation of negating any idea of stretching the concept of ecclesia in block 2. Conclusion is simply leftist phenomenology is not the answer. That is not the answer. There are significant differences between Christianity and other religions. So he tells us in a matter-of-fact way, in order to launch part 3 of the book, that we revalue world religions because of one concrete goal. We want to open up dialogue. We want to open up dialogue and reverse prior attitudes. Replace contempt with esteem, neglect with understanding, propaganda with dialogue. Use native clergy when possible and discover true inspiration through dialogue. That's the approach that defines the concept of revaluing. That describes revaluing according to Professor Kuhn. Stretching the concept of the church in block 2 is not acceptable. Yes, there is a universality of the church, but it is the Church of Jesus Christ, and it does include all denominations, Protestant and Catholic alike. But we don't just stretch the concept of ecclesia to include everyone and anyone without distinction, because there are very substantial differences when considering the Christian church, which he will bring up in the next lesson. So all of it concludes in this particular lesson. It all concludes with a negative assessment of the postmodern phenomenology that was just emerging when he was writing this in 1976. It hadn't fully blossomed, but the new phenomenology was surfacing, not yet fully being put forward, but it was being given birth. The French rereading of German idealism, which sprang up a very leftist phenomenology from the French, where they really did force Hegel to be a phenomenologist and not a metaphysician. And that's all well and good, but Professor Kuhn says you can't take phenomenology and wipe out the substantial differences between Christian religion and other religions. There are substantial differences. Yes, there are similarities. We address world order, we address human identity, we address ethics, we address the way of salvation, but there are substantial differences. There's a difference between many differences that need to be addressed, but that's going to come up in our next lesson. He will take these matters up and discuss them, but in this lesson we get the launching point, the beginning of part 3 of the book. And he just wants to begin by saying, let's just don't start out negative. Let's start out with revaluation. Let's start out with revaluation. If we start out with revaluation, then we're going to start out with the attitude that says, yes, we are open to dialogue. Yes, we are open to discussing the common crossroads that we all share. The question of human alienation. The question of the way out, the way of salvation. The question of world order. Of human identity. What does it mean to be human? And ethics, ethical awareness. All of that needs to be addressed in dialogue. We don't shut down dialogue. And then from there, he always goes from the theoretical to the concrete. We get the concrete aspects addressed in block 2. And then his conclusion for the initial beginning of this third part of the book, that phenomenology is not the once and for all answer. Yes, phenomenology is valuable because he even told us in the previous lesson that we begin with human experience of the real. Well, that's a beginning in phenomenology. So yes, it's important. Yes, it is a tool. Yes, we will enlist it. But it's not the answer to substantial differences in religion. You don't just blur them away. So that's going to wrap up our initial launch of Part 3, pages 89 to 99. We're going to pick up next time on page 100.